One of the oldest codes when it comes to Western video game industry trends is this idea that Ultima was this hugely popular, successful RPG franchise that influenced a number of notable Japanese video game franchises. This is and always has been a complete and total farce meant to downplay the innovators of the video game industry. I over the past several years I have heard a number of people bring up this claim that Ultima influenced Zelda, it influenced Dragon Quest, it influenced every JRPG franchise on the planet. And in actuality, those RPG franchises took more influence from Dragon Quest, which innovated and improved on the Ultima formula in and of itself. If it wasn't for that overrated man-child Spoonie, nobody under the age of 50 would even know that Ultima exists. This is an RPG franchise that has been lost to time, that is irrelevant, that has been mogged by Dragon Quest, by Final Fantasy, by Tales, by Pokemon, by Golden Sun, by Fire Emblem. The list goes on and on and on. Ultima is nothing but a curiosity of the early 80s that was almost immediately eclipsed in relevancy by the far more popular, successful, and higher quality Nintendo properties.
It's kind of remarkable the lengths that the Western gaming industry has gone to try and downplay and ignore the Japanese gaming industry. Back in the 80s and 90s, the narrative was that like Doom and Ultima were these huge trend-setting games while actual gamers were playing GoldenEye, Gradius, Super Mario Bros, Donkey Kong Country, the works. You know, those are the games that far surpassed everything from the PC gaming community. Those were the games that people remember and look back on, and those were the games that would go on to become all-time classics. Like the entire idea, the mythology that the West created these timeless works of art in video games is completely laughable. You know, these days nobody has even heard of titles like, say, Dragster or you know, Pitfall, but you know everyone knows Super Mario Bros. Everyone knows The Legend of Zelda, and increasingly everyone is learning about Dragon Quest. You know its history in the industry, its influence over countless other franchises, and its long-term relevancy as one of the biggest video game IPs in Japan. However, the video game industry has always been very, very against this idea of allowing JRPGs to get any kind of attention at all. You know, back in the 2000s, you know, like the creators behind Knights of the Old Republic, like kind of, they released an official statement saying that Japanese RPGs aren't real RPGs, that Knights of the Old Republic is way better than anything Japan has ever come up with, and, you know, 20 years later, nobody even remembers Knights of the Old Republic or Mass Effect, and everyone still looks back on Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger as the peak of the genre, you know? And the same could be true said for Dragon Quest, right? This is an IP that far surpassed anything that Ultima did on PC in the early 80s. It took the initial idea and improved on it far beyond what Richard Garriott could ever come up with, and it has remained relevant for 40 years, long after Ultima 9 killed the IP and made it completely irrelevant in 1999. You see, Ultima fans have this tendency of doing this weird thing where they try and pretend that Ultima is way more influential than it actually is. You know, I've seen people say that Miyamoto admitted that Ultima influenced The Legend of Zelda, and they cite this specific interview, and if you actually read the interview, he says nothing of the sort. You know, the entire idea that the Japanese video game industry was inspired by Ultima is completely ridiculous. You know, these were developers and creators that were making very well-established fantasy genre concepts into the video game format that Ultima itself lifted from a variety of other sources, such as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Arthurian lore, and more. You know, like Ultima in and of itself was not that fresh, original, or exciting. When you play the very first Ultima game, and you end up fighting a TIE fighter, you're not interacting with the peak of originality and creativity, are you? You know, and that's the weird double standard about the Ultima fan base. You know, the narrative that Dragon Quest somehow owes its entire success and legacy to Ultima, because Ultima did come first, but did it have the same impact? Did it sell as well? Did it have as long of a legacy? And the answer to all of that is no. You know, if you actually look at Dragon Quest, you know, all the spin-offs, like, you know, the anime, the like everything Dragon Quest has done, like, you know, the games that were directly influenced by Dragon Quest, like what you get is like this huge cultural Japanese phenomenon, okay, that has gone on to sell like 100 million units worldwide and is like seen as like the progenitor of the genre. Meanwhile, you have Ultima, which was essentially a curiosity of the 80s, in which this very niche developer created like this extremely cutting edge RPG based on his D&D campaigns, released it, had it be relatively successful for the time, but eventually it got eclipsed in relevancy by the far superior Nintendo titles. You know, like Ultima does absolutely have a place in history as, you know, a video game RPG on PC. You know, it has its niche following. It's fine for what it is. But to say that like it's the granddaddy of the genre, that it's like some huge influential fantasy RPG, especially for Japanese developers, is downright ridiculous. Like most Japanese audiences are not familiar with Ultima. You know, like Yuji Horii played it, and was influenced by it, but he is an enthusiast, you know? Like, he was an enthusiast of that kind of thing. And it inspired him to make Dragon Quest, and his take on the RPG format eventually eclipsed Ultima and kind of become the de facto, you know, definitive video game RPG at this point. And that's kind of the problem. You know, when you really stop and think about it, when you think about what the debate between Western RPGs and Japanese RPGs actually amounts to, like, Japanese RPGs want to be actual video games that take advantage of the format and actually have a variety of different settings, ideas, gameplay mechanics, radically different characters, radically different storylines and tones, settings, you know, all these wildly different things that can only be done in the video game medium. And then you look at like the Western RPG format, and all it wants to be is like D&D, you know, like, and that's all they really can do is just like, you know, create the illusion of like having a freedom of choice, create the illusion of being in an open world, you know, create the illusion that you're going on this grand adventure, but in actuality, like, the game is entirely very much railroaded, that it's not as deep or complex as what like Dragon Quest would be able to accomplish, and it kind of offers the illusion of freedom. You know, Baldur's Gate 3 is a really good example of that. You know, like how much were we told that like the game was completely open-ended and that it can go in all these different directions, and yet somehow inexplicably, eventually as you go on throughout, like you eventually get railroaded more and more through the plot. Like that's you know, that's a very good example of what I'm talking about. You know, the JRPG format of having like, you know, a standard, well-written, engaging narrative and a world that suits it is far, far superior. But the Western RPG industry, like, in its desperate attempt to create relevancy, like, has created this weird obsession, influenced by Ultima, of having this, like, completely open-ended experience. Like, no matter how terribly thought out the world is, no matter how nothing about it makes any sense, like, it's open and it's wide and you have a lot of dialogue options, and that's what makes it better. In short, I feel as if it's safe to say that Dragon Quest was indeed influenced by Ultima, but all the games that came after it in Japan were directly influenced by Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy was not knocking off Ultima, it was influenced by Dragon Quest. All these other RPG franchises, all these other video games were taking influences from Dragon Quest, not from Ultima. So that is why the JRPG industry has developed the way it has. They're all trying to accomplish what Dragon Quest has accomplished. They're all trying to, like, do the same kind of thing with their own unique style and flavor, and a lot of them have had a lot of success. Meanwhile, in the Western video game industry, all they can do is just kind of sit on their front porch and seethe about like, oh man, things were so much better back in my day. Ultima was so much better than what the games the kids today are playing. It's like it's just a giant cope, and it always was. But at this point, considering we live in a world where we're getting games like, say, Dragon Quest Builders 2, a game where you're like literally building castles to invade, to stop invasions from like random monsters, this crazy 100-hour long experience. Like that one spin-off Dragon Quest game is probably bigger and better than all of the Ultima games combined. You know what I mean? It's like Ultima just was not able to compete with Dragon Quest long term, and that's very observable simply by what Ultima game have you played recently? You know what I mean? Like it's remarkable seeing like the current state of the gaming industry, seeing the current state of like where we're at and what's happening, and seeing how so many people are like bending over backwards to try and keep up the narrative that Dragon Quest is failing, or that Zelda was influenced by Ultima, and that like the Western video game industry was like way better than the Japanese before like the woke crowd took over, and I do think it's very, very important for us to acknowledge just how much better Japanese entertainment has been. It's kind of shocking to me, like even in this era where like virtually everything is unwatchable, virtually everything is controlled, everything's pushing an agenda, like you still have like a pretty dedicated section of you have a pretty dedicated demographic of people who just completely refuse to engage with anything Japanese. They hate JRPGs, but will worship shit like Expedition 33. They hate Japan and yet like complain about the way female characters look in video games. They hate Japan and yet they constantly just use like Japanese technology. It's embarrassing. It has been for a long time, and I've been very vocal about how much I detest this mindset. Razorfist is a pretty big offender of this. Like, secretly, Japanese people are just imitating the Western culture from 50 years ago. Like, come on, talk about a giant cope. Like, that's not true. That never will be true. And like, you really do need to accept it. Honestly, like that's kind of my mindset as we're like. As we're looking at what's happening in the gaming sphere, where like Nintendo's winning the console war, and everyone's in denial about it. PlayStation relocated to America; they're an American brand now. Xbox is failing. Both of them are American brands. Sega, it's more well known now that Sega is an American company, always has been. You have all these American brands failing to the superior Japanese one, and yet like. You can't really find anybody who would admit it. Like that's the big thing that we're having an issue with right now. That's the thing that we're seeing. That's the problem with the current state of things right now, is that certain groups of people are just like refusing to acknowledge just how much better Nintendo and Japan is in the West when it comes to like this sort of thing. We do have better comics. Japan does have better video games. Like Japan does have like a better culture. Like they have less diversity, which is a good thing. They have all this stuff, and yet like for some inexplicable reason, a lot of people in the Western video game sphere, who, by the way, love to pride themselves on, like, being diverse, like, accepting individuals, like, they are extremely xenophobic towards Japanese products. And that's what this Western RPG versus Japanese RPG argument essentially amounts to, is that this is a cope to justify their own racism against the Japanese. Like, they don't care about Western RPGs. They don't care about Japanese RPGs. Like, all this is an attempt at trying to justify their nonsense. Like, if you believe Western RPGs are better than JRPGs, that simply means that you've never played a JRPG in your life. And The whole Ultima versus Dragon Quest argument is a very, very good example of that phenomenon.